I am Richard, 65 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent a lifetime calculating load-bearing limits. I always knew exactly how much pressure a foundation could take before it shattered. But nothing prepared me for the call I received last Tuesday. My son Daniel, a commercial airline pilot, called me from the galley of a Boeing 777 bound for Paris. His voice was trembling, stripped of his usual professional calm. He told me he just watched his wife Vanessa board business class holding hands with another man. Seconds later, my phone vibrated with a photograph he managed to snap from the boarding bridge. I stared at the high-resolution screen, my blood running completely cold. Because as I looked down the hallway of my own home, my daughter-in-law was currently in the living room doing yoga. She looked up from her mat, brushed a strand of dark hair from her face, and smiled brightly at me. Before I continue this story, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever discovered a betrayal so deep it made you question your own reality. The silence in my study was absolute, broken only by the frantic breathing of my son echoing through the phone speaker. Daniel was thousands of miles away, standing in an aluminum tube, preparing to cross the Atlantic, and his world was collapsing. I looked closely at the photograph on my screen. The woman in the picture had her face turned slightly away, but there was no mistaking the sharp jawline, the distinct curve of her shoulders, and most damning of all, the custom emerald pendant resting against her collarbone. It was the necklace Daniel had commissioned for their 3rd anniversary. The man beside her had a familiar build, wearing a tailored charcoal suit, his hand resting intimately on the small of her back. Then I looked down the long, oak-paneled hallway of my house. The woman in the living room was holding a warrior pose. She wore the exact same face, the same hair, the same athletic frame. But the emerald necklace was missing. "Dad, are you there?" Daniel asked, his voice cracking with a vulnerability I had not heard since he was a teenager. "Tell me she is home. Tell me I am losing my mind." I took a slow, deep breath, pulling upon 40 years of professional discipline. In my career, panic was the enemy of survival. I had to stabilize the structure before I could assess the damage. I looked directly at the woman in the living room. She held my gaze, her smile unwavering, entirely unaware of the digital execution taking place in my hand. "She is right here in front of me," I said, forcing my voice into a low, reassuring register. "I am looking right at her, Daniel. She is doing her morning stretches. It is a doppelganger, a trick of the light, and a similar haircut. You are exhausted from back-to-back international routes." I heard a heavy exhale on the other end of the line. The relief in his breath was palpable, yet laced with residual doubt. I ordered him to sit down, drink a glass of water, and focus on flying his route safely. I promised him I would take Vanessa out to lunch and send him a picture to prove she was firmly on American soil. I hung up the phone before he could argue further. The dial tone hummed in my ear as the true gravity of the situation settled over me. I placed the phone face down on my mahogany desk. The woman in the living room was an impostor. I remained in the shadows of the study, watching her breathe. She rolled up her yoga mat with practiced efficiency. For the past 12 months, Vanessa had been systematically convincing my son that my mind was deteriorating. She would hide my reading glasses and claim I left them in the refrigerator. She would alter the dates on my medical appointments and sigh loudly when I missed them, whispering to Daniel that my memory was becoming a hazard. She constantly referenced my failing vision, insisting I should no longer drive or manage my own finances. I had endured her condescending tone in silence, believing she was simply overprotective, or perhaps anxious about aging. I now realized the terrifying truth. She was not worried about my health. She was conditioning me. She was building a narrative of senility so that if I ever noticed a discrepancy in her behavior, if I ever saw through the illusion she was carefully crafting, my testimony would be dismissed as the ramblings of a confused old man. She needed me to doubt my own senses. I stepped out of the study and walked down the hallway. The floorboards did not creak beneath my leather slippers. As I entered the living room, the smell of eucalyptus oil hung heavily in the air. The impostor turned toward me, wiping her forehead with a small towel. "Good morning, Richard," she said cheerfully. Her voice was an exact replica of Vanessa's, possessing the same slightly breathless cadence. "Would you like me to put the kettle on for your tea?" I need a moment to confirm the depth of this deception. I smiled back, letting my shoulders slump slightly, playing the role of the docile, fading patriarch she expected me to be. "That would be lovely, my dear," I replied. "My memory is a bit foggy this morning. I was just looking at an old photograph of Daniel in my study. It made me think of his childhood dog. Do you remember him telling you about Barnaby?" The woman paused, the towel hovering near her chin. Her eyes flicked slightly to the left, a micro-expression of rapid calculation. I kept my face entirely blank. "Oh, Barnaby," she said, letting out a soft, nostalgic laugh. "Yes, of course. The Irish setter. Daniel told me he was an absolute menace. Did he really chew through the baseboards in the kitchen?" She delivered the lie with flawless confidence. The warmth in her eyes was incredibly convincing. She added the detail about the baseboards to prove her intimacy with my son's history, attempting to solidify her disguise. "Yes, he certainly did." I chuckled, nodding slowly. "A terrible menace." I turned my back to her and walked slowly toward the kitchen. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained perfectly steady. Daniel never owned an Irish setter named Barnaby. Daniel was born with severe pet dander allergies. He spent his entire childhood terrified of dogs after being bitten by a stray when he was 7. He had never spoken a fond word about an animal in his life. The woman standing in my house had studied a script, but she did not know the man she was pretending to be married to. I told her I needed to check the circuit breaker in the garage because the hall lights were flickering. She nodded, humming quietly, as she filled the kettle with water. I stepped into the cool, damp air of the attached garage and closed the heavy fire door behind me, ensuring it clicked shut. The garage was dimly lit, housing my old workbench and the sleek silver sedan Vanessa had driven home last night. I approached the vehicle. I knew Vanessa always left her car doors unlocked when parked inside the garage. I pulled the handle. It opened with a soft click. I slid into the driver's seat. The interior smelled different. Vanessa wore a heavy floral perfume that always lingered in the upholstery. This car smelled of stale coffee and cheap vanilla air freshener. I opened the glove compartment. It was meticulously organized, filled with the standard vehicle manuals and insurance cards, all bearing Vanessa's name. It was too clean. It was a prop. I ran my hands along the undersides of the seats, feeling for anything out of place. My fingers brushed against the floor mat on the passenger side. It felt slightly raised. I lifted the heavy rubber mat. Beneath it, taped securely to the floorboard, with a strip of black electrical tape, was a small plastic Ziploc bag. I peeled the tape back. The adhesive was fresh, clinging stubbornly to my fingers. Inside the bag was a single piece of paper. It was a vehicle registration card. I pulled my reading glasses from my pocket and held the paper up to the dim overhead light. The car was not registered to Vanessa Caldwell. It was registered to an address in a low-income neighborhood 3 towns over. The name printed on the legal document was Melanie Vance. I stopped breathing. The name hit me with the blunt force of a physical blow. Melanie was Vanessa's identical twin sister. 5 years ago, shortly after Daniel and Vanessa started dating, Vanessa came to our house in tears. She told us Melanie had been struggling with severe addiction and had died of a fentanyl overdose in a motel room on the coast. We had paid for the cremation. We had held a small memorial service in our backyard. Daniel had held Vanessa as she wept over a wooden urn. I stared at the registration card. The expiration date was listed as next year. The sister was not dead. The tragic backstory, the tears, the funeral expenses, it had all been a brilliantly executed stage play to remove the twin from the public record, keeping her in the shadows as a perfectly identical asset. This was no longer a simple case of a dissatisfied wife taking a weekend trip with a lover. This was a massive, calculated conspiracy. Vanessa had resurrected her dead sister to act as a physical alibi inside my own home, guaranteeing that if anyone saw her in Paris, she had undeniable proof that she was sitting in my living room drinking tea. She was not just cheating on my son. She was preparing to completely destroy him, and she needed an airtight alibi to pull the trigger. I folded the registration card and slipped it into my breast pocket. The grieving father, the confused old man, he died right there in the front seat of that silver sedan. I stepped out of the car, closed the door without making a sound, and prepared to dismantle her entire life. I returned from the garage and found the impostor sitting on the sofa, scrolling lazily through a tablet. I rubbed my eyes, letting my shoulders slump heavily, putting the weight of my 65 years fully on display. I told her my joints were aching terribly, and I needed to take my usual afternoon nap. She offered a sympathetic, condescending smile, the exact kind you give a tired child, and told me to rest well. I walked slowly up the main oak staircase, making sure my footsteps sounded heavy and uncoordinated. I paused halfway up, clutching the banister, and releasing a ragged sigh, playing my part to absolute perfection. The moment I reached the upper landing, safely out of her line of sight, my entire posture changed. The manufactured fatigue vanished. I was no longer a frail, confused old man waiting for his medicine. I was a structural engineer preparing to inspect a critically compromised foundation. My heart was beating entirely too fast, hammering against my ribs, and a sharp, familiar pain flared deep in my left knee. It was a permanent souvenir from decades of walking narrow steel girders on freezing construction sites. I ignored the pain. My body might have been aging, but my mind remained as sharp and unforgiving as a steel trap. I needed to get inside the master suite. Vanessa always kept the master bedroom locked whenever Daniel was away on a flight rotation. She claimed it was for her personal security, a lingering habit from living alone in the city. I stood quietly before the heavy, solid wood door. The brushed brass handle was locked tight. A normal person in my situation might have panicked, looked for a hidden spare key, or perhaps even tried to force the door open. But brute force always leaves evidence, and I could not afford to leave a single trace of my presence. I spent my entire professional life designing secure commercial facilities. I knew intimately that every lock, no matter how expensive, possesses a mechanical tolerance, a tiny margin of error built into the internal mechanism. I reached into my trouser pocket and pulled out a thin, rigid strip of plastic I had carefully cut from an empty fertilizer tub in the garage. My hands shook slightly, a frustrating physical betrayal of my underlying nerves, but I forced my fingers to lock into a steady grip. I slid the plastic into the narrow seam of the door, feeling blindly in the dark for the angled metal strike plate. The process took 3 agonizing minutes. My own breathing sounded deafeningly loud in the quiet hallway. I pressed my shoulder weight against the heavy wood just enough to shift the internal frictions of the locking mechanism, and applied a sharp, precise upward pressure with the plastic strip. The internal latch clicked. It was a sound no louder than a snapping dry twig, but in the absolute silence of the second floor. It echoed in my ears like a gunshot. I froze completely, holding my breath, listening intently for any sudden movement downstairs. The television continued to murmur softly from the living room. The decoy had not heard a thing. I pushed the door open very slowly and stepped inside, closing it silently behind me until I heard the latch secure itself once more. The master suite was immaculate. It smelled strongly of expensive lavender oil and cold, calculating ambition. Vanessa had redecorated this entire room immediately after I transferred the ownership of the house into Daniel's name. She had ripped out the warm carpets my late wife had chosen and replaced them with stark imported hardwood flooring. Everything in the room was perfectly aligned, entirely sterile, revealing absolutely nothing on the surface. But I was not looking for hidden diaries or carelessly discarded letters. I was looking for a structural anomaly. People hide their darkest secrets in the places where they feel the absolute most control. I closed my eyes for a long moment and visualized the original architectural blueprints of my house. I remembered the exact mathematical spacing of the wooden floor joists I had laid with my own 2 hands 30 years ago. I opened my eyes and began to walk the perimeter of the room. I did not just look at the floor. I felt the physical structure beneath my feet. I walked a tight, methodical grid across the expensive hardwood, feeling for the microscopic give of a hollow cavity. My knees almost burned fiercely with the intense effort of stepping so deliberately, but my focus was unbreakable. Near the back wall, deep inside her massive walk-in closet, the acoustic resonance of the floor changed. It was a remarkably subtle difference, a slightly duller sound, when the heel of my shoe struck the polished wood. I knelt down slowly on the floor of the closet. My joints popped loudly in the confined, quiet space. I ran my bare fingertips along the tight seams of the hardwood planks. The carpentry was excellent, but an experienced engineer knows that natural wood breathes and shifts with changes in temperature. One specific plank near the white baseboard lacked the microscopic buildup of dust present in all the surrounding grooves. It had been moved recently. I pulled a small flathead screwdriver from my pocket, wedged the tip carefully into the tight seam, and applied gentle, calculated leverage. The wooden plank popped up smoothly, revealing a dark, square cavity hidden securely between the floor joists. Nestled tightly inside the hollow space was a heavy steel box. It was not a standard combination safe you buy at a hardware store. It was a high-grade biometric lockbox, the exact kind used to store highly secure corporate assets. I stared down at the dark, glassy surface of the fingerprint scanner. The sheer expense and sophisticated nature of the device told me everything I needed to know. You do not purchase a safe like this to hide old love letters or spare cash. You buy this kind of vault to hide absolute ruin. I ran my thumb lightly over the cold steel edge, knowing brute force or lock-picking tools would never open it. I needed her fingerprint. But Vanessa was currently in Paris with another man. Then I remembered the woman sitting on my sofa downstairs. Identical twins share the exact same genetic DNA, but they do not share the same fingerprints. However, they share the same face, the same voice, and in this case, the same dark secrets. If Vanessa had orchestrated this massive, flawless illusion, she would have built logical redundancies into her master plan. She would have registered the Decoy sister as a backup fingerprint to access this safe in case of a sudden emergency. I slid the wooden floorboard perfectly back into place, ensuring the seam was completely flush and invisible. The next step of my operation was absolutely clear. I had to go back downstairs and steal a fingerprint. I quietly descended the main oak staircase, ensuring my footsteps remained heavy and uneven to maintain the absolute illusion of my physical decline. The house was perfectly silent, except for the low murmur of the television echoing from the living room. The impostor was still resting comfortably on the sofa, entirely unaware of the discovery I had made in the garage. I walked straight past the living room and entered the kitchen. My current objective was simple in theory, but incredibly fragile in execution. I needed a clean, unsmudged fingerprint. Human skin constantly secretes natural oils and sweat. When a finger presses against a smooth, non-porous surface, it leaves behind an exact topographical map of those microscopic ridges. I knew from my engineering background that heavy lead crystal was the perfect medium for this task. The glass stored in our upper dining cabinets was completely smooth and retained human oils perfectly. I pulled a small wooden step stool to the counter and reached for the top shelf. I intentionally bypassed the everyday plastic drinking cups and selected a heavy crystal tumbler. I placed it gently on the cool granite island. Now I needed a catalyst. I needed an undeniable excuse to make her hold this exact glass with a firm, solid grip. I opened the pantry door and scanned the shelves until I found a large, heavy glass jar of thick blackberry preserves. I carried the jar to the center of the kitchen floor. I took a deep, steadying breath, braced my nerves, and simply let the heavy jar slip from my fingers. The sound of the thick glass shattering violently against the hard ceramic floor tiles was deafening. Dark purple syrup and jagged, lethal shards of glass exploded across the pristine white kitchen floor. I immediately let out a startled cry, purposefully pitching my voice high and unsteady. The television in the living room went silent instantly. I heard the frantic slap of bare feet against the hardwood floor as the decoy rushed toward the kitchen. She stopped abruptly in the doorway, staring at the catastrophic mess spreading rapidly across her clean floor. I stood trembling in the center of the room, clutching my chest and breathing in rapid, shallow gasps. I looked at her with wide, terrified eyes, playing the role of the humiliated, failing old man to absolute perfection. "I am so sorry," I stammered, letting my voice shake uncontrollably. My hands just gave out on me. I could not hold it. "The arthritis is so terrible today. I am so terribly clumsy." She let out a long, heavy sigh, completely dropping the sweet, devoted facade she had maintained earlier. Her eyes rolled slightly in obvious deep irritation. "Just step away from the glass." "Richard," she said, her voice suddenly sharp and commanding. "Do not move another inch until I get the broom. You are going to cut yourself and bleed everywhere." I shuffled backward slowly, leaning heavily against the edge of the granite island for support. "My heart is racing so fast," I whispered, pressing my hand firmly against my sternum, as if I were in actual medical distress. "Please, my dear. I feel faint. Could you pour me a glass of ice water before you clean this up so I can take my medication?" I pointed a trembling finger directly at the crystal tumbler resting on the counter. She walked over to the island, carefully stepping over the shattered preserve jar. She grabbed the crystal tumbler with a huff of profound annoyance. I watched her right hand incredibly closely. Her bare fingers wrapped completely around the smooth surface of the glass, her thumb pressing firmly against the heavy base to support the significant weight of the crystal. She shoved the glass under the refrigerator dispenser, filling it rapidly with ice and water. She turned and shoved the cold glass toward my chest. "Here, drink this and go sit down in the study," she ordered, completely dropping any remaining pretense of familial affection. "I will clean up this absolute disaster." I reached out and took the glass. I was incredibly careful with my own movements. I pinched the very top rim of the crystal with my index finger and thumb, ensuring my own skin never touched the smooth lower sides where her hand had just rested. I nodded weakly, keeping my head bowed in fake humiliating shame. "Thank you, Vanessa," I muttered. "I am so sorry for being such a heavy burden to you." She did not even bother to answer me. She was already aggressively pulling thick wads of paper towels from the rack. I turned and walked slowly toward my study, carrying the wet glass as carefully as if it were a live explosive device. I entered my private study and quietly locked the heavy mahogany door behind me. I walked directly to my large drafting table and turned on the high-intensity architect lamp. I placed the chilled crystal tumbler carefully on a clean sheet of white drafting paper. The cold condensation was already beginning to form on the outside of the glass, threatening to wash away the natural oils of the print. I had to act immediately before the water droplets ruined the evidence. I pulled open the top drawer of my wooden desk. I bypassed the standard writing pens and reached far back for my old structural engineering tools. I selected a solid graphite drafting pencil, an incredibly sharp steel razor blade, and a roll of wide, transparent packing tape. I sat down heavily at the drafting table and adjusted the metal arm of the lamp, angling the bright, harsh beam directly onto the curved surface of the glass. By tilting my head slightly, I caught the reflection of the light. There, perfectly preserved on the crystal, was the distinct oily smudge of her right thumb and index finger. The prints were absolute perfection. The heavy weight of the glass and her sheer irritation had forced her to grip it tightly, leaving deep, unbroken ridges of natural oil against the smooth surface. I took the steel razor blade and held it at a sharp downward angle against the exposed lead of the graphite pencil. With slow, remarkably precise scraping motions, I shaved a microscopic pile of fine graphite dust directly onto the white paper. The dust was lighter than air, composed of pure dark carbon. Once I had accumulated a sufficient mound of black powder, I picked up a soft camel hair dusting brush I formerly used for cleaning delicate architectural models. I dipped the very tips of the soft bristles into the pile of graphite powder. I held my breath to avoid scattering the dust. I gently tapped the wooden handle of the brush over the side of the glass, allowing the fine black dust to cascade softly over the invisible fingerprints. The carbon powder immediately adhered to the sticky natural oils left by her skin. I blew gently on the glass to remove the excess loose dust. The fingerprints instantly materialized against the crystal with shocking, undeniable clarity. The unique whorls, the sweeping loops, the distinct arches of her genetic identity were now permanently mapped in black carbon. I picked up the heavy roll of transparent packing tape. This was the most critical physical moment of the entire operation. If my hand shook, if I allowed a single microscopic air bubble to form, the print would distort, and the biometric scanner upstairs would reject it entirely. I pulled a smooth, unbroken strip of tape from the roll and sliced it clean with the sharp razor blade. I held the edges of the tape taut between my two index fingers. I lowered the sticky side of the tape directly onto the clearest, most defined thumbprint. I pressed it down in one fluid rolling motion, starting from the center and pushing firmly outward to eliminate any pockets of trapped air. I used the smooth, rounded edge of my own thumbnail to burnish the tape firmly against the graphite powder, forcing the strong adhesive to capture every single valley and ridge of the print. I grabbed the corner of the tape and peeled it back in one swift, unbroken motion. I held the strip of tape up to the bright light of the architect lamp. The black fingerprint was lifted perfectly suspended securely in the clear adhesive. It was a flawless biometric key. I pressed the piece of tape onto a clean, rigid strip of thick acetate plastic, sealing the fragile fingerprint safely so it could be handled without smudging. I slipped the plastic strip carefully into the breast pocket of my shirt. I took the crystal glass, wiped it completely clean with a microfiber cloth to destroy the remaining evidence and set it aside on the desk. I unlocked the study door and listened intently to the hallway. The kitchen was completely quiet. The impostor had finished cleaning the floor and had apparently returned to her television program. The coast was entirely clear. I stepped out of the study and began the long, quiet climb back up the main staircase. My bad knee throbbed with a renewed vicious ache, but I barely registered the physical pain. My mind was already back inside the master suite, calculating the terrible odds of my gamble. If Vanessa was as brilliant and paranoid as her meticulous plan suggested, she would never rely on a single point of failure. She would have programmed this identical twin as a living, breathing skeleton key. I reached the second-floor landing and approached the heavy master bedroom door. I used the plastic strip from my pocket to quietly manipulate the internal lock once again, slipping back into the cold, sterile sanctuary of their bedroom. I walked directly into the massive closet, knelt on the hardwood floor, and removed the false floorboard. I stared down at the dark, glassy eye of the biometric scanner waiting inside the hidden cavity. I pulled the piece of acetate from my shirt pocket. I placed my own thumb directly behind the captured fingerprint, aligning it perfectly to provide the necessary heat and pressure. I took a slow, deep breath, prepared myself for the worst, and pressed her stolen identity firmly against the cold glass scanner. The cold glass of the biometric scanner felt unyielding beneath my thumb. I held the small square of acetate plastic firmly against the device, aligning the lifted fingerprint of the twin sister with absolute precision. My own heartbeat drummed a heavy rhythmic warning in my ears. If the machine detected the flat plastic surface instead of the electrical capacitance of human skin, a security lockout would trigger. I closed my eyes and pressed down, applying the exact amount of body heat and pressure necessary to mimic a living human touch. The machine remained silent for 3 agonizing seconds. Then a microscopic green LED light blinked twice in the darkness of the closet floorboard cavity. The heavy steel locking mechanism disengaged with a deep mechanical thud. I exhaled a breath I did not realize I was holding. I carefully set the acetate strip aside and gripped the recessed handle of the vault. The heavy steel door swung upward on silent pneumatic hinges. A soft battery-powered light illuminated the interior of the safe. It was not filled with jewelry or stacks of illicit cash. It was completely packed with thick, neatly organized manila folders. It looked like a miniature corporate archiving room. I reached inside and pulled out the first thick stack of papers. The top folder was labeled with Daniel's name in Vanessa's elegant, sloping handwriting. I opened the folder and spread the documents across the hardwood floor of the closet. They were comprehensive financial statements spanning the last 3 years. I quickly scanned the columns of numbers, my engineering mind rapidly processing the data. These were the records for Daniel's airline pilot pension fund and his private investment portfolios. When Daniel first married Vanessa, he had proudly told me he was building a massive nest egg so they could retire early and travel the world together. The statements from 2 years ago showed a robust, rapidly growing balance. But as I flipped through the more recent months, a chilling pattern emerged. Massive, systematic withdrawals had been executed week after week. Tens of thousands of dollars were being routinely siphoned out of Daniel's secure accounts and transferred into a series of opaque offshore shell companies. I stared at the final statement dated just 3 days ago. The balance on his primary retirement account, a fund he had spent 10 grueling years building by flying red-eye routes and missing holidays, was practically zero. Vanessa had bled him completely dry. She had reduced my son's entire life of hard work to a few meaningless pennies. The sheer ruthlessness of the theft made my stomach twist, but I forced myself to keep reading. The drained accounts were only the appetizer. The true main course was hidden in the next folder. I reached back into the cold steel vault and withdrew a heavy leather-bound folio. My own name was embossed on the spine. My hands finally began to tremble as I opened the cover. Inside were the original property deeds and title documents for the estate I was currently standing in. 2 years ago, shortly after my wife passed away, I made a decision born entirely out of love and a desire to protect my only son. I had seen too many grieving families torn apart by brutal probate courts and endless inheritance taxes. I wanted to ensure Daniel would always have a secure home no matter what happened to me. So I legally transferred the total ownership of the estate into Daniel's name. It was a massive gesture of trust. I had built this house from the ground up, pouring every ounce of my professional skill and personal savings into its foundation. But I had not been entirely foolish. I had my lawyer draft a specific life estate clause as a condition of the transfer. That legally binding clause guaranteed that I had the absolute right to live in this house until the day I died. Daniel owned the property, but he could not sell it, or evict me without my explicit, notarized signature, revoking my life rights. I had assumed that piece of paper was a mere formality, a simple legal safeguard that would never actually be tested. I was devastatingly wrong. I stared down at the documents resting on my knees. The top page was a formal revocation of my life estate clause. It stated that I, Richard Caldwell, was voluntarily surrendering all my rights to the property due to failing health, and that I was willingly relocating to a permanent assisted living facility. At the bottom of the page, resting above the printed line, was my signature. It was an absolutely flawless forgery. She had captured the exact slight tremor in my handwriting, the specific way I crossed my letters, the subtle slant I had used since college. Beside my forged signature was the official stamp of a licensed notary public. The pieces of the nightmare rapidly locked together in my mind, forming a terrifyingly clear picture. Vanessa had spent the last year convincing everyone, including Daniel, that my mind was failing. She was laying the psychological groundwork to justify my sudden removal to an asylum. With the forged revocation of my life rights, the estate was entirely unencumbered. But Vanessa did not want to simply own the house. She wanted to liquidate it entirely and disappear. I dug deeper into the leather folio and pulled out the final, most damning document. It was a massive international loan agreement. Vanessa had used the unencumbered estate as collateral to secure an $8 million loan from a private overseas lending firm. She was cashing out the total equity of the property I had spent my entire life building. The final page of the loan agreement required 2 signatures. One belonged to Vanessa. The other line was designated for Daniel's private wealth manager, Colin Stanford, the very same man I had just seen holding hands with Vanessa in the photograph my son sent me from the airplane. Colin was not just a lover. He was the internal financial architect of this entire criminal enterprise. He had the high-level clearances to authorize the massive transfers, to bypass the standard banking security flags, and to legitimize the fraudulent loan application using his pristine corporate credentials. They were partners in every sense of the word. They had drained Daniel's cash, forged my signature, to steal the house, and secured an $8 million payout. I looked at the date required for the final loan execution. The transaction was scheduled to clear this week. That was exactly why they were on a flight to Paris. They were traveling to the international headquarters of the lending firm to sign the final physical documents in person, far outside the jurisdiction of American financial regulators. Once those papers were signed, the $8 million would instantly wire into their untraceable offshore accounts. They would vanish into the luxurious European sunset, leaving Daniel entirely bankrupt and leaving me legally evicted, branded as an incompetent old man with nowhere to go. The sheer scale of their ambition was breathtaking. They had calculated every single variable removed, every obstacle, and manipulated our love into a lethal weapon against us. They thought they had accounted for everything. They thought they were dealing with a naive pilot who was never home and a senile engineer who could not remember where he left his glasses. They were wrong. I did not feel panic. I did not feel despair. As I looked at the forged signature designed to destroy my life, I felt a deep, profound clarity settle over my mind. The structural integrity of their massive conspiracy relied entirely on the assumption that I was ignorant of their actions. I carefully gathered the financial statements, the forged deed, and the loan documents. I used the camera on my mobile phone to take high-resolution photographs of every single page, capturing the dates, the account numbers, and the routing information. Once I had documented their entire fraudulent empire, I placed the papers perfectly back into their respective folders. I set the folders back inside the steel vault exactly as I had found them. I closed the heavy safe door. The locking mechanism engaged with a solid final click. I replaced the wooden floorboard, ensuring the seam was completely invisible. I stood up in the quiet closet and brushed the dust from my trousers. The timeline was incredibly tight. Vanessa and Colin would land in Paris in a matter of hours. I had less than 2 days to engineer a catastrophic structural failure of their entire plan, and I knew exactly who I needed to call to help me build the guillotine. I stood in the center of the master bedroom, the heavy silence of the house pressing down on my shoulders. I pulled my mobile phone from my trouser pocket and opened the photograph my son had sent me just an hour ago. Earlier, my attention had been entirely consumed by the shock of seeing Vanessa holding hands with another man and the terrifying realization that her identical twin was downstairs. Now armed with the horrifying truth I had just unearthed from the hidden biometric safe, I examined the digital image through the lens of a forensic investigator. I zoomed in on the background of the photograph. Behind Vanessa and Colin Stanford, the illuminated departure board of the airport terminal was slightly out of focus, but the bold yellow letters were distinct enough for me to read. Flight 409, non-stop service to Charles de Gaulle Airport, Paris. It was not a romantic getaway or a spontaneous weekend vacation. It was a highly calculated, meticulously timed business execution. The private international lending firm listed on the $8 million loan agreement I had just photographed was headquartered in the 8th arrondissement of Paris. I sat down slowly, on the edge of the unmade bed, doing the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of our survival. I spent my entire career calculating stress limits and load-bearing timelines. I knew how to identify the exact moment a structure would suffer a catastrophic collapse. Today was Tuesday afternoon on the east coast of the United States. The transatlantic flight to Paris would take approximately 9 hours. They would land in France just as the European financial institutions opened their heavy glass doors for the Wednesday morning business session. The offshore loan agreement required physical signatures in the immediate presence of the firm's senior underwriters. This was a mandatory protocol designed to bypass standard international fraud alerts for high-value transactions. Colin Stanford was not just going along for the trip. With his pristine, verifiable reputation as a senior private wealth manager, he was the essential key to the entire operation. He would walk into that Parisian office, present his corporate credentials, and personally vouch for the legitimacy of the transaction. He would present my flawlessly forged signature, legally authorize the encumbrance of my estate, and initiate the massive wire transfer. Once an international wire transfer of $8 million clears the European banking system, the money essentially vanishes from the visible world. It does not simply sit in another bank account where a lawyer can freeze it. It fragments immediately. It splits into dozens of untraceable encrypted accounts nested deeply within anonymous shell companies across the globe. I realized with a sickening clarity that the total equity of my property, the wealth I had spent 40 grueling years building, would evaporate into thin air by Thursday afternoon. I closed my eyes and visualized the immediate devastating fallout of their success. When the massive international loan inevitably defaulted in a few months because Vanessa clearly had no intention of ever making a single payment. The overseas lending firm would legally seize this property. The house I built with my own hands for my late wife, the custom hardwood floors I laid on my knees, the backyard garden where my son took his first stumbling steps, would all be aggressively auctioned off to the highest corporate bidder. Daniel would return from his current flight rotation, expecting to sleep in his own bed. Instead, he would find his retirement bank accounts completely empty, his investment portfolios drained to zero, and his childhood home foreclosed by a foreign bank. He would be completely bankrupt, emotionally destroyed by his wife's betrayal, and saddled with massive, insurmountable legal debts trying to prove a fraud that spanned multiple international borders. His career as a commercial pilot, which required intense focus and strict psychological evaluations, would likely crumble under the crushing weight of the stress. And my own fate had been even more carefully engineered by the woman I had welcomed into my family. Vanessa had already forged the medical directives and the formal revocation of my life estate clause. The exact moment the $8 million cleared into her offshore accounts, she would undoubtedly submit those forged documents to the county health department and the local probate court. I would not just be rendered homeless. I would be legally declared a ward of the state. I would be dragged from this house by court-appointed officers and permanently locked inside a sterile, underfunded assisted living facility. I would be stripped of my financial autonomy, my personal dignity, and my legal voice. Any frantic attempt I made to report the $8 million theft to the authorities would be instantly dismissed as the tragic paranoid delusions of a senile old man. She had built a perfect, inescapable cage around me, using my own unconditional love for my son as the iron bars. The sheer breathtaking perfection of their cruelty did not break my spirit. Instead, it completely crystallized my resolve. For the past 12 months, I had played the role of the quiet, fading, agreeable father, simply to keep the peace in my family. I had swallowed my pride daily. I had ignored her constant passive-aggressive insults about my memory. I had allowed her to completely manage the household finances because I sincerely thought it relieved a burden from my son's shoulders. I had foolishly confused my own silence with strength. But silence in the face of absolute malice is not strength at all. It is complicity. I stood up from the bed. The sharp pain in my knee had entirely vanished, replaced by a cold, highly focused adrenaline coursing through my veins. I walked out of the master suite, pulling the door completely shut, and listening to ensure the manipulated latch clicked securely locked behind me. I had exactly 48 hours before the European bankers processed the wire transfer and destroyed my family. 48 hours before my son was ruined and I was imprisoned in a medical facility. I needed a weapon. I needed a legal architect who understood exactly how to collapse a fraudulent structure with surgical, devastating precision. I walked down the main staircase, completely abandoning the heavy, uncoordinated shuffle I had been practicing all year. I moved with the silent, purposeful, and upright stride of a man preparing to go to war. As I reached the bottom floor and turned into the hallway, the impostor sister was just walking out of the kitchen, holding a fresh glass of iced water. She stopped abruptly in her tracks and looked at me, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. The change in my physical posture was impossible for her to ignore. "Are you feeling better, Richard?" she asked, her voice dripping with artificial forced sweetness. "You look entirely different. You were walking so quickly just now." I stopped and looked directly into her eyes. The physical resemblance to my daughter-in-law was absolutely uncanny, a perfect genetic mirror. But without the expensive emerald necklace and the deeply ingrained arrogance that Vanessa carried, this woman was nothing more than a cheap, desperate copy playing a dangerous game she did not fully comprehend. "I am feeling remarkably refreshed," I replied, keeping my vocal tone perfectly even and pleasant. The afternoon nap did absolute wonders for my circulation. In fact, I feel well enough to take a short, brisk walk to the local pharmacy. I believe I need to refill a prescription before the evening. She looked highly hesitant, her eyes darting toward the front door. She was clearly wondering if she should physically stop me to maintain strict control of the environment until her sister completed the transaction in Paris. "Are you absolutely sure you should be walking alone in your condition?" she pressed, taking a slow step toward me to block the hallway. "I really do not want Daniel getting upset with me if you wander off and get confused in the neighborhood. We both know your memory has been slipping terribly lately." I smiled at her. It was a genuine, terrifying smile born from the absolute certainty of what I was about to do to her and her treacherous sister. "I deeply appreciate your concern for my well-being, Vanessa," I said deliberately, using the name she had stolen to keep her comfortable in her lie. "But I assure you, my memory is perfectly clear today. I know exactly where I am going, and I know exactly what needs to be done." Before she could offer another fabricated excuse to detain me or call her sister in a panic, I turned smoothly and walked to the front hall closet. I pulled my heavy wool overcoat from the hanger and stepped out the front door into the crisp, cooling afternoon air. The heavy deadbolt clicked shut behind me, sealing the decoy safely inside my home, where she could not interfere. I walked purposefully down the long driveway toward the quiet suburban street. I was not going anywhere near the pharmacy. I was walking straight to the train station. I was going to the financial district downtown to see Jonathan Pierce. The train ride into the city financial district was a blur of gray concrete and steel. I did not sit down. I stood by the heavy metal doors the entire 40-minute journey, my mind actively building the framework of my retaliation. I walked the 3 blocks from the station to the towering glass skyscraper that housed the law firm of Pierce & Associates. Jonathan Pierce was not just my attorney. We had played poker every second Thursday of the month for the last 20 years. He was a ruthless corporate litigator, a man who viewed the legal system not as a balanced scale of justice, but as a battlefield, where the only acceptable outcome was the total financial ruin of his opponent. I did not want a sympathetic friend today. I needed a shark who understood the absolute architecture of destruction. The receptionist recognized me immediately and ushered me directly into his expansive corner office. Jonathan was reviewing a thick contract, his silver pen poised over the paper. He looked up, took one look at my rigid posture, and immediately closed the file on his desk. He asked me what was wrong. I did not waste time with polite pleasantries or emotional breakdowns. I pulled my mobile phone from my pocket, opened the digital photo gallery, and placed the device flat on his polished mahogany desk. I told him to look at the first photograph. Jonathan put on his reading glasses and studied the image of Vanessa and Colin Stanford walking onto the jet bridge. He recognized Colin immediately because they ran in the same elite financial circles. Then I swiped to the next series of photographs. I showed him the high-resolution images of Daniel's drained retirement accounts. I watched the muscles in Jonathan's jaw tighten as he rapidly processed the staggering financial loss. But it was the final photograph that made the blood completely drain from the veteran lawyer's face. It was the digital copy of the property deed transfer and the formal revocation of my life estate clause. Jonathan leaned in incredibly close to the glowing screen. He swore softly under his breath, a rare break in his usually impenetrable professional armor. He looked up at me and stated that he had personally drafted that life estate clause 2 years ago to be absolutely ironclad. He pointed at the screen and said the signature was a breathtaking forgery. He noted that the notary stamp beside my forged name was completely legitimate, meaning Vanessa had likely bribed a corrupt official to validate the false surrender of my rights. Jonathan explained the immediate legal reality with brutal clinical efficiency. He told me that with this single piece of paper, Vanessa had legally erased my existence from the property. She had presented a clean, unencumbered title to the overseas lending firm, effectively turning my life's work into a massive unsecured cash machine for her own personal use. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the sprawling city skyline. I told Jonathan they were currently flying over the Atlantic Ocean. I explained they would land in Paris by tomorrow morning and sign the final physical documents to secure an $8 million loan against my house. I told him about the identical twin sister sitting in my living room, acting as a physical alibi, perfectly insulating Vanessa from any domestic suspicion. Jonathan sat back in his heavy leather chair, steepling his fingers together. The sheer audacity of the criminal enterprise clearly impressed his strategic litigator mind. He immediately began outlining our defensive options. He said he could draft an emergency injunction and file it with the local county court by tomorrow morning. He explained this action would put a temporary legal freeze on the property title, automatically causing the Parisian bank to reject the loan application when they ran their final global asset check before releasing the funds. He assured me this would protect the house and keep me from being legally evicted. I turned away from the window and shook my head slowly. I told Jonathan that a temporary injunction was entirely unacceptable. If we simply blocked the transaction at the last second, Vanessa and Colin would instantly realize they were caught. They would destroy whatever remaining evidence they had in Europe, fly back to the United States, and claim the forged document was a simple banking error or a misunderstanding. They would hire their own aggressive defense attorneys, using the hundreds of thousands of dollars they had already stolen from my son's retirement funds. They would drag Daniel through years of agonizing, drawn-out divorce court, bleeding him financially dry, while they walked away relatively unscathed. I walked back to his desk and leaned over the polished wood. I looked Jonathan directly in the eye and told him I did not want to stop them from jumping off the cliff. I wanted to let them jump, but I wanted to make absolutely sure we moved the safety net before they hit the ground. I reminded Jonathan that Vanessa had not just stolen money from a joint marital account. By forging my signature to secure a multi-million-dollar loan across international borders, she had escalated a domestic dispute into a massive federal crime. Jonathan smiled slowly, a sharp, dangerous expression that entirely transformed his face. He understood exactly what I was suggesting. He stated that if we let the offshore bank process the loan, the crime of federal wire fraud would be fully executed the exact second the funds were transmitted. But we needed a way to control where that massive sum of money landed. If it went into Vanessa's hidden offshore shell companies, it would fragment into 1,000 untraceable pieces across the globe, and we would never see it again. We needed to build a trap perfectly disguised as a successful robbery. Jonathan pulled a blank legal pad toward him and began writing rapidly. He explained that since I was the true legal owner of the life estate, and since we had irrefutable photographic proof of an active financial conspiracy, he could contact his former colleagues at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He proposed a highly coordinated maneuver. Instead of freezing the property title, we would let the title clear. But Jonathan would legally intercept the receiving routing numbers on the loan document. He told me we would allow Colin and Vanessa to sit in that luxurious Parisian office and sign the final papers, believing they had won everything. The bank would approve the $8 million wire transfer. But the money would not go to their hidden accounts. It would be silently rerouted directly into a frozen federal escrow account, monitored by the authorities. The trap was incredibly risky, but the payoff was absolute. They would return home confident and wealthy, totally unaware that they had just financed their own federal indictments. I agreed to the plan without a single moment of hesitation. I told Jonathan that my son had dedicated his entire adult life to providing a beautiful home for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than an expendable resource. She had planned to have me committed to a psychiatric ward just to silence me. I wanted them to feel the exact same absolute helplessness they had designed for my family. Jonathan picked up his office phone and told his secretary to cancel his remaining appointments for the next 2 days. He looked at me and said we had a tremendous amount of federal paperwork to file before the sun came up in Paris. I sat down in the leather chair opposite his desk, my mind perfectly clear and cold. The architecture of their ruin was officially underway. I just needed to go back to my house and play the role of the foolish dying old man for 48 more hours while the federal net closed entirely around them. Jonathan did not waste a single second. He picked up the heavy black receiver of his desk phone and bypassed his secretary entirely, dialing a secure number from memory. He did not call the local police precinct. He did not call the county fraud division. He called a direct line to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically reaching out to a senior special agent in the white-collar crime division whom he had known for over a decade. I sat perfectly still in the leather chair, watching my lawyer transform from a corporate advisor into a lethal legal weapon. I listened as Jonathan spoke in rapid clipped sentences, bypassing all pleasantries. He laid out the exact parameters of the conspiracy with clinical precision. He detailed the forged revocation of my life estate, the $8 million international loan, the involvement of a licensed private wealth manager, and the imminent flight to Paris. The silence in the room was heavy as Jonathan listened to the federal agent on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint metallic scratch of the voice coming through the receiver. The agent was asking for the specific routing numbers of the offshore shell accounts Colin Stanford had established. Jonathan read the numbers directly from the high-resolution photographs I had taken of the hidden documents in the biometric safe. He explained that we did not want to file a standard injunction to freeze the property title. He stated explicitly that we wanted to authorize a shadow intercept. Jonathan placed the phone on speaker so I could hear the federal agent explain the mechanics of the trap. The agent had a deep, gravelly voice that commanded absolute authority. He explained that the global banking system operates on a highly automated network. When Colin and Vanessa signed the final documents in Paris, the European lending firm would initiate an international wire transfer. That massive sum of money would hit a central clearinghouse before being dispersed to their hidden offshore accounts. Because I was the verified legal owner of the encumbered property, and because we had irrefutable photographic evidence of an active forgery crossing international borders, the Bureau could legally insert a digital tripwire at that exact clearing level. The agent clarified that the Parisian bank would receive a completely normal confirmation code. Colin Stanford would check his secure banking application on his phone and see that the wire transfer had been successfully processed. Vanessa would believe she was instantly a multimillionaire. They would celebrate in their luxury hotel completely unaware that the $8 million never actually reached their offshore shell companies. The funds would be seamlessly diverted into a heavily monitored frozen escrow account controlled entirely by the United States federal government. The sheer brilliance of the maneuver settled over me like a heavy winter blanket. If we had simply blocked the loan application, Vanessa and Colin would have returned to the United States and played the victims. They would have claimed the forged signature was a clerical error made by the bank. They would have hired aggressive defense lawyers and dragged my son through a grueling decade-long divorce, slowly bleeding his remaining assets dry while they walked free. But by allowing the wire transfer to execute, we were allowing them to cross a catastrophic legal threshold. The moment that money moved across international borders based on a forged signature, the crime escalated from a simple domestic dispute into massive federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and international money laundering. I was not just stopping a theft. I was actively choosing to send my daughter-in-law to a federal penitentiary for a very long time. I thought about my son Daniel. I thought about the thousands of hours he had spent flying red-eye cargo routes, exhausting his body and mind, to provide Vanessa with a life of absolute luxury. I thought about how she had repaid his unconditional devotion by secretly draining his retirement accounts and plotting to have his own father locked inside a psychiatric ward. Any lingering trace of mercy I might have held for her evaporated completely. I looked at Jonathan and told the speakerphone that I fully authorized the intercept. The federal agent instructed Jonathan to immediately draft a sworn affidavit detailing my consent to the shadow operation. He said they needed my physical signature on the federal documents before the European markets opened the next morning. Jonathan disconnected the call and immediately began typing furiously on his computer keyboard. The only sound in the expansive corner office was the sharp, rhythmic clatter of the keys. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the bustling city streets below. People were rushing to catch trains and buy coffee, completely unaware of the invisible high-stakes warfare being waged in the glass towers above them. After 20 minutes of intense focus, the heavy laser printer in the corner of the office hummed to life. It began spitting out thick stacks of legal documents with a warm, rhythmic sound. Jonathan gathered the warm pages, aligned them perfectly on his mahogany desk, and handed me his heavy silver fountain pen. "These are sworn federal affidavits, Richard," he said, his voice dropping to a low, serious register. "By signing these pages, you are officially entering into a coordinated operation with the federal government. You are stating under penalty of perjury that the signature on the life estate revocation is a forgery, and you are authorizing the Bureau to seize the incoming loan funds. Once you sign this, there is no turning back. We cannot undo this trap once it is armed. The moment Colin presses that button in Paris, his life and Vanessa's life are effectively over." I took the silver pen from his hand. I did not hesitate. I did not let my hand shake. I leaned over the desk and signed my true, authentic signature on the bottom line of every single page. The ink flowed smoothly across the heavy legal paper, a dark blue contrast to the stark black text. It was the exact same signature she had tried to perfectly replicate to destroy me. Now that same signature was sealing her absolute doom. Jonathan gathered the signed affidavits and immediately fed them into a high-speed encrypted scanner on his desk. He transmitted the digital files directly to the secure server of his contact at the Federal Bureau. We waited in complete silence for 3 agonizing minutes. Then a sharp chime echoed from Jonathan's computer. He opened the encrypted email, read the single line of text, and looked up at me with a cold, satisfied smile. "The federal tripwire is officially live," he announced softly. "The escrow account is completely armed and waiting in the shadows. Now comes the hardest part of the entire operation for you, Richard." I asked him what I needed to do. Jonathan leaned forward and folded his hands on the desk. He told me that I had to go back to my house and walk right past the identical twin sister sitting in my living room. He explained that Melanie was the most volatile variable in this entire equation. If I acted too confident, if I slipped up and revealed that I knew her true identity, she would immediately panic. She would send a frantic text message to Vanessa in Paris, warning her that the illusion had failed. If Vanessa received that warning before the final loan documents were signed tomorrow morning, She and Colin would instantly abort the transaction. They would not initiate the wire transfer, and the federal trap would catch absolutely nothing. Jonathan looked at me with intense seriousness. He told me I had to go back and be the pathetic, failing old man they all believed I was. I had to let the Decoy sister disrespect me. I had to let her patronize me. I had to endure the humiliation completely and utterly, because every single second I kept her comfortable and arrogant was another second closer to the Parisian bank opening its doors. I nodded slowly, fully absorbing the massive psychological weight of his instructions. I had spent 40 years building massive steel structures designed to withstand incredible external pressure. Now the structure I had to fortify was my own mind. I thanked Jonathan for his swift and ruthless execution of the plan. I put my heavy wool overcoat back on and walked out of the law firm. The sun was beginning to set as I walked back toward the train station. The sky above the city was painted in dark, bruising shades of purple and gray. The physical ache in my knee had returned a dull throb, reminding me of my age, but my mind was completely galvanized. I boarded the commuter train and sat in silence as the landscape shifted from towering steel skyscrapers back to the quiet, tree-lined streets of my suburban neighborhood. I was returning to a home that had been converted into a hostile stage set. I had to walk through the front door and look into the face of a woman who had helped plan my destruction, and I had to smile. I closed my eyes as the train rumbled down the tracks, preparing myself to deliver the greatest acting performance of my entire life. I walked up the dimly lit driveway of my own home, the heavy wool overcoat providing little comfort against the biting evening wind. The house was bathed in the harsh artificial glow of the exterior floodlights. I paused on the front porch, rolling my shoulders and consciously adjusting my posture. I let the sharp, focused energy drain completely from my spine. I allowed my knees to bend slightly, my breathing to become shallow and labored, and my eyes to take on the dull, vacant stare of a man slowly losing his grip on reality. I unlocked the heavy oak door and pushed it open. The foyer was completely dark, but the living room television was muted, casting a flickering blue light across the hardwood floor. Melanie was standing directly in the center of the hallway. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. The casual, relaxed demeanor she had displayed earlier was completely gone. She looked incredibly agitated, her jaw clenched tight, her breathing rapid and uneven. She was holding her mobile phone in her right hand, her thumb hovering directly over the glowing screen. She demanded to know where I had been. She stated that a simple walk to the local pharmacy does not take 4.5 hours. Her voice lacked the practiced, gentle cadence of my daughter-in-law. It was sharp, nasal, and laced with genuine panic. She was a hired actor who suddenly realized she had lost control of her primary subject, and she was terrified of the immediate consequences. I stepped fully into the house and closed the door behind me, leaning heavily against the wood, as if the physical effort had completely exhausted me. I offered her a weak, confused smile. I told her the pharmacy line was terribly long, and I had decided to sit on a park bench to watch the pigeons for a while because the afternoon air felt so remarkably pleasant. My excuse was flimsy, deliberately crafted to sound like the rambling justification of a deteriorating mind. Melanie did not buy it. Her eyes narrowed into angry slits. She took an aggressive step toward me, raising her mobile phone up to my face. She told me she had been worried sick. She said she was exactly 2 seconds away from calling Daniel at his airline, and she was already dialing Vanessa on her international number to report my sudden disappearance. My chest tightened painfully. The absolute terror of the situation gripped my heart. If she placed a call to Vanessa right now, the entire federal operation Jonathan and I had just spent hours building would instantly collapse. Vanessa would land in Paris, turn on her mobile phone, and see a frantic message from her sister, stating that I had vanished for hours. Her paranoid criminal mind would immediately assume I had discovered the forgery or gone to the police. She and Colin Stanford would abort the $8 million loan transfer, immediately destroying our only chance to lock them in a federal prison. I had to stop Melanie from pressing that call button. I could not use physical force. I had to use the one absolute weakness that had brought her into this house in the first place. I had to appeal to her overwhelming, desperate greed. I let out a long, highly exaggerated sigh of defeat. I reached up and rubbed my temples with trembling fingers. I told her she was absolutely right to be upset with me, and I apologized profusely for causing her such terrible worry. I confessed that I had not actually gone to the pharmacy at all. I told her I had lied because I was deeply embarrassed about my failing memory, and I wanted to do something completely on my own, without feeling like a helpless burden. I explained that I had actually taken the commuter train downtown to visit my old bank branch. The mention of a bank caused an immediate microscopic shift in her posture. The tight grip she held on her mobile phone loosened just a fraction. Her eyes, previously filled with panic and suspicion, suddenly sparked with intense curiosity. I slowly unbuttoned my wool overcoat and shuffled into the living room, gesturing for her to follow me. I sat down heavily on the edge of the sofa, letting my hands shake visibly as I reached into my breast pocket. I looked up at her with an expression of profound, misplaced affection. I told her that over the past few months, I had come to realize just how incredibly difficult it must be for her to care for a sick, dying old man. I played directly into the exact narrative she and her sister had constructed. I said I knew my mind was slipping, and I knew I would probably have to move into an assisted living facility very soon, so I would not ruin her beautiful marriage to my son. I thanked her for her endless patience. I thanked her for putting up with my constant mistakes. I laid the guilt and the false gratitude on incredibly thick, painting myself as the ultimate tragic victim who was entirely grateful to his abuser. Melanie stood in the center of the room, completely silent. She was absorbing every single word, her ego swelling with the absolute validation of their cruel scheme. She truly believed she had me entirely fooled. She believed she was looking at a broken, pathetic man who was willingly submitting to his own destruction. I pulled my leather checkbook from my pocket. I also retrieved the expensive fountain pen Jonathan had given me, though I was not using the disappearing ink this time. I needed this specific trap to be entirely permanent and completely traceable. I opened the checkbook and rested it on my trembling knee. I told her that before I lost my faculties completely, I wanted to do something to ensure she knew how much I truly appreciated her sacrifice. I explained that I had closed out a small forgotten savings account from my engineering days. I slowly wrote out the current date. I wrote the name Vanessa Caldwell on the payee line, knowing full well that Melanie possessed the fraudulent identification or the practiced forgery skills necessary to cash it. Then I moved to the numerical box. I let my hand hesitate for a brief moment, ensuring she was watching closely. I wrote a 1 followed by 4 thick, dark zeros. $10,000. I carefully spelled out the amount on the legal line, my handwriting deliberately shaky but perfectly legible. I ripped the check from the binding with a sharp, satisfying tear. I held it out toward her. I told her I wanted her to take this money and buy herself something incredibly beautiful. I suggested she take a luxury vacation or buy that diamond bracelet she had always admired. I told her she deserved a massive reward for being such a wonderful, devoted daughter-in-law to me. Melanie stared at the small slip of paper in my trembling hand. I watched the intense internal war play out across her face. The cautious, paranoid conspirator screamed at her to maintain the plan, to call her sister, to report my highly unusual behavior to the other side of the world. But the desperate, impoverished woman who lived in a rundown apartment and drove a car that smelled of stale smoke simply could not resist the lure of instant wealth. $10,000 was a completely life-altering sum of money for her. It was pure, untraceable cash handed directly to her by a foolish old man who was practically begging her to take it. The overwhelming greed washed over her features, entirely erasing the suspicion and the panic. She slowly lowered her mobile phone. She reached out and snatched the check from my fingers with shocking speed. A massive, genuine smile broke across her face entirely, replacing the hostile glare from moments ago. She looked at the numbers written in blue ink and let out a soft gasp of sheer delight. She told me I was far too generous, and she promised not to tell Daniel about my little secret trip downtown. She assured me that my secret was perfectly safe with her. She folded the check carefully and slipped it deep into the pocket of her yoga pants. The immediate crisis was completely averted. I had successfully bought her absolute silence, and I had officially secured the 48-hour window necessary to destroy them all. I told her I was going upstairs to rest for the evening. She nodded enthusiastically, her mind completely consumed by the $10,000 resting in her pocket. As I climbed the oak staircase, I felt a deep, dark sense of satisfaction. She thought she had just robbed a helpless old man. She did not realize that by accepting that physical check, she had just tied herself directly to the financial timeline of the federal conspiracy. When the Federal Bureau swept through this house, that cleared check would prove Melanie was not just a passive bystander. It would prove she was a paid active accomplice in the defrauding of my estate. I had just handed her the very rope she would use to hang herself. It was 3 a.m. when my mobile phone vibrated violently against the wooden nightstand. The sudden harsh buzzing shattered the absolute silence of my dark bedroom. I had not slept a single minute since I handed the Decoy sister that $10,000 check downstairs. I was lying flat on my back, staring at the ceiling, mentally reviewing every single variable of the federal trap Jonathan and I had constructed. I reached out in the dark and grabbed the phone. The caller identification displayed my son's name. I swiped the screen to answer and pressed the device tightly against my ear. The line was filled with the hollow, rushing sound of international static, followed by the heavy, ragged breathing of my son. "Dad, I found her," Daniel whispered. His voice was completely unrecognizable. It was thick, with a toxic mixture of profound grief and absolute violent rage. "I am standing in the hallway of the hotel in the 1st arrondissement. She is in suite 412. I can hear them talking through the door, Dad. I can hear him laughing." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles ached. Daniel had not followed my instructions to stay on his assigned flight route. The moment he landed his commercial plane, he had used his airline credentials and his intimate knowledge of her travel habits to track her directly to her luxury hotel. He was standing mere inches away from the woman who had destroyed his life, and he was completely ready to tear the heavy wooden door off its hinges. "I am going to kick this door down," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, guttural growl. "I am going to walk in there and break his jaw. I am going to make her look me in the eye and tell me why she did this." The raw agony in his words tore directly through my chest. Any father in the world would want to tell his son to break the door down and reclaim his dignity. But I knew the absolute legal architecture of the situation. If Daniel kicked that door down right now, the physical confrontation would result in his immediate arrest by the French police. More importantly, Vanessa and Colin would instantly abort the financial transactions scheduled for the morning. The $8 million federal wire fraud would never take place, and the trap Jonathan and I had meticulously armed would catch absolutely nothing. "Daniel, you must listen to me very carefully," I commanded, keeping my own voice incredibly low and entirely devoid of emotion. "Do not touch that door. Do not raise your voice. Step away from the suite and walk to the elevator right now." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. "Are you out of your mind?" he asked, his breathing accelerating. "My wife is sitting in a hotel room with my private wealth manager. I am not walking away from this. I am going to destroy them both right here in this hallway." I closed my eyes and forced myself to deliver the devastating truth. "You cannot destroy them with your fists, Daniel," I said plainly, "because they have already destroyed you on paper." "I need you to hear me," I continued, speaking rapidly, but with absolute clarity. "While you were flying cargo routes over the ocean to buy her expensive jewelry, Vanessa was completely emptying your retirement accounts. She has drained every single penny of your pension and your private investment portfolios. She transferred all of your life savings into offshore shell companies managed by Colin Stanford. The heavy breathing on the other end of the line stopped completely. The silence was absolute. I knew the sheer magnitude of the betrayal was paralyzing his mind, but I did not have time to let him process the grief. I had to keep pushing the knife deeper to force his absolute compliance. "It gets worse, Daniel," I said softly. "She did not just steal your cash. She forged my signature on a legal revocation of my life estate clause. She bribed a notary to make it look official. She used your childhood home, the estate I transferred to you 2 years ago, as collateral to secure a massive international loan from a private lending firm located just a few blocks away from where you are standing. They are going to that office at 9:00 this morning to sign the final physical documents. The loan is for $8 million. The moment they sign those papers, the money vanishes overseas, you are entirely bankrupt, and the bank will foreclose on our home. They also plan to use those forged medical documents to have me permanently committed to a psychiatric ward, so I can never testify against them." I heard a sickening hollow sound through the phone as Daniel slumped against the elegant wallpaper of the Parisian hotel hallway. He could not comprehend the sheer breathtaking cruelty of the woman he loved. He had married her believing they were building a foundation for a beautiful future. He did not realize he had simply invited a parasite into his life, a creature that had systematically fed on his hard work, his trust, and his love until there was absolutely nothing left but an empty shell. Why, he finally whispered, his voice completely broken. "Why would she do this to us?" I told him that evil does not require a logical reason. It only requires an opportunity, and his unconditional love had provided her with the perfect cover to execute her greed. "But we are not going to let them win," I stated, my voice hardening into a steel rod. "Jonathan and I have spent the last 12 hours working directly with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have placed a digital tripwire on the international routing numbers Colin intends to use this morning. We are going to let them walk into that office and sign those fraudulent papers. We are going to let them initiate the $8 million wire transfer. Because the exact second they execute that transaction, using my forged signature, they are committing massive federal wire fraud and international money laundering. The money will not go to their hidden accounts. It will be seamlessly diverted into a frozen escrow account controlled by the United States government. But none of that happens if you knock on that door," I warned him, stressing every single syllable. "If you confront them now, Colin will check his phone, cancel the loan appointment, and they will walk away clean. They will use the hundreds of thousands of dollars they already stole from your retirement to hire aggressive defense attorneys. They will drag you through years of brutal divorce court, and they will likely succeed in painting you as an unstable, violent husband. You will lose your career as a commercial pilot. You will lose your house, and I will be dragged out of my home by court-appointed officers. You have a choice to make right now, Daniel. You can have 5 minutes of physical satisfaction in that hallway, or you can have absolute, permanent justice." The silence stretched for an agonizing eternity. I could hear the faint sound of a door opening down the hall, the muffled sound of French being spoken by a passing hotel guest. I knew exactly what I was asking him to do. I was asking a proud, fiercely loyal man to swallow the ultimate humiliation. I was asking him to stand outside the room where his wife was sleeping with another man and simply walk away in total silence. It was the hardest thing a father could ever demand of his son. I waited in the darkness of my bedroom, my heart pounding against my ribs, praying that I had instilled enough discipline and cold logic in him during his childhood to override the burning fire of his current rage. Finally, I heard the faint, soft rustle of fabric as Daniel pushed himself away from the wall. "I am walking toward the elevator," he said. His voice was no longer trembling. It was completely hollow, stripped of all warmth and all mercy. The devastated boy who had called me yesterday was completely gone. The man speaking to me now was a soldier who had just accepted a lethal assignment. I told him to go directly to the airport and use his professional clearance to board the very next cargo flight back to the United States. I told him he needed to be sitting at my dining room table tomorrow evening when Vanessa returned from her supposed yoga retreat. I need you to come home and look her right in the eye, I instructed him quietly. I need you to smile at her. I need you to ask her how her weekend was, and I need you to let her believe she has won everything. Can you do that for me, Daniel? Can you endure that for one more day? I heard the distant chime of the hotel elevator arriving on his floor. Yes, Dad, he replied coldly. I can do it. I will see you tomorrow. He ended the call before I could say another word. The line went dead. I lowered the phone to my chest and closed my eyes, letting out a long, shuddering breath. The absolute hardest part of the entire ordeal was over. My son had not broken. The final piece of the architecture was firmly in place and the execution was completely set. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 times, marking the arrival of Tuesday evening. I sat completely still in my worn leather armchair, positioned perfectly in the shadows of the living room. The television was playing a classic film at a low volume, providing the perfect auditory cover for my observation. I was not watching the screen. My eyes were fixed on the reflection in the large bay window, which gave me a clear view of the kitchen and the back patio door. Melanie, the Decoy sister, was pacing nervously near the kitchen island. She kept glancing down at her mobile phone, her thumb tapping anxiously against the granite counter. Suddenly, the screen illuminated. I saw the tension instantly drain from her shoulders. She let out a long, heavy sigh of profound relief. She had received the signal. The transatlantic flight had landed, and the primary actor was returning to the stage. Melanie quickly gathered her small canvas tote bag and the $10,000 check I had given her earlier. She did not even bother to check if I was awake. She simply slipped out the back patio door, closing it with a soft metallic click, and vanished into the evening shadows. The house was entirely silent for exactly 4 minutes. Then I heard the heavy, familiar sound of a vehicle pulling away from the curb outside, followed immediately by the jingling of keys against the metal lock of the front door. The heavy oak door swung open, and Vanessa walked inside. The sheer absolute audacity of the transition took my breath away. She was wearing the exact same dark athletic leggings and gray sweater that her sister had been wearing all afternoon. She was carrying a brown paper grocery bag filled with fresh vegetables and a loaf of artisan bread, projecting the flawless image of a devoted housewife returning from a mundane errand. But while the clothing was an identical match, the energy she carried into the room was entirely different. Melanie had reeked of cheap vanilla and desperate nervous energy. Vanessa walked into my home smelling of expensive duty-free perfume and the unmistakable intoxicating aura of absolute victory. Her posture was perfectly straight, her chin held high, her eyes shining with a dark, triumphant thrill. She believed she had just pulled off the greatest financial heist of her life. She believed the $8 million was currently resting securely in her offshore accounts. She looked around the foyer with the smug, proprietary gaze of a woman who believed she now owned every single piece of wood and glass in the building. She walked into the living room and set the grocery bag down on the coffee table. She looked at me sitting quietly in my armchair. I immediately let my head droop slightly, forcing my eyes to look unfocused and tired. "Hello, Richard," she said, her voice dripping with an artificial, sickening sweetness. "I hope you had a restful afternoon. I just ran out to the organic market to pick up some things for dinner. Daniel texted me that his flight schedule changed, and he will be home tonight, so I want to make his favorite meal." The level of her psychological sickness was truly breathtaking. Less than 12 hours ago, she was standing in a luxurious Parisian office beside her lover, forging my signature to steal my home and bankrupt the very husband she was now pretending to cook for. She had crossed an ocean, committed massive federal wire fraud, and returned to my living room without a single trace of guilt or hesitation. She was a masterclass in sociopathic deception. "That sounds wonderful, Vanessa," I replied, keeping my voice weak and slightly raspy. "I must have fallen asleep in my chair. I did not even hear you leave the house." She smiled a wide, brilliant smile that reached her eyes, but contained absolutely zero warmth. It was the smile of a predator admiring a particularly docile lamb. "Oh, you were sleeping so peacefully, I simply could not bear to wake you," she lied smoothly, walking over to adjust the blanket over my knees. "You just rest right there, Richard. You do not have to worry about a single thing anymore. I am going to take care of absolutely everything from now on." The double meaning hidden in her words was sharp and cruel. She was actively mocking me to my face, enjoying the secret thrill of her hidden conquest. She thought she was telling me that my days of freedom were officially over, and my new life in a locked psychiatric ward was rapidly approaching. I looked up at her perfect, arrogant face and offered her a slow, trembling nod. I thanked her for being so incredibly kind to me. I let her bask entirely in the warm, glowing light of her false victory, knowing that the federal guillotine was already suspended directly above her neck, just waiting for the perfect moment to drop. The smell of roasting garlic and fresh rosemary began to fill the lower level of the house. I remained in my leather armchair, listening to the rhythmic chopping of a heavy kitchen knife against the wooden cutting board. Vanessa was preparing a massive, elaborate dinner. She was humming a light, cheerful melody as she moved between the granite island and the stainless steel stove. The domestic performance was absolutely flawless. If a stranger had walked into my home at that exact moment, they would have seen a loving, dedicated woman preparing a warm meal for her weary father-in-law and her returning husband. They would never suspect that the woman chopping vegetables was a calculated predator who had just returned from an intercontinental flight designed to bankrupt our entire family. I forced myself to stand up from the armchair, letting my knees pop loudly in the quiet room. I shuffled slowly toward the kitchen, dragging my left foot slightly across the hardwood floor. I sat down on one of the tall wooden stools at the island, wrapping both hands around a warm mug of chamomile tea she had poured for me earlier. I watched her work. Her movements were incredibly energetic, fueled by the massive adrenaline rush of her supposed financial victory in Paris. She wiped her hands on a clean linen towel and turned toward me with a bright, predatory smile. She told me that the county tax assessor had mailed a routine verification form while I was asleep. She reached into her canvas tote bag, the same bag she had undoubtedly carried onto the transatlantic flight, and pulled out a crisp, white envelope. She extracted a thick, legally binding document and slid it across the smooth granite counter toward my tea mug. She tapped her manicured fingernail against a yellow sticky note attached to the bottom of the final page. She casually explained that it was just a standard property tax update for the upcoming fiscal year. She said the county simply needed my signature to confirm my continued residency in the home so we could maintain our senior citizen tax exemption. Her voice was incredibly light, airy, and completely devoid of any underlying tension. I looked down at the document. My failing eyesight was a complete fabrication, but I deliberately pulled my reading glasses from my pocket and pushed them slowly up the bridge of my nose. I leaned forward and examined the paper. The front page was indeed a generic county tax form downloaded directly from the internet and printed in low resolution. But my trained architectural eyes immediately scanned the heavy black text hidden beneath the cover sheet. It was not a tax verification form. It was the final irrevocable release of the estate trust. The European lending firm required this specific physical document to accompany the forged life estate revocation she had submitted in Paris. This piece of paper legally confirmed that I was of sound mind and that I was permanently surrendering all financial claims to the property equity without any coercion. It was the final absolute failsafe required by the international underwriters before they would release the $8 million into her offshore accounts tomorrow morning. She had brought this document back from France, and she needed my actual authentic signature on it to close the final loop of her massive conspiracy. She picked up a cheap plastic ballpoint pen from the counter and pressed it into my trembling hand. She told me to just sign on the yellow line so she could mail it back tomorrow morning and get it out of the way. She leaned over the counter, invading my personal space, her expensive perfume completely overpowering the smell of the roasting garlic. Her eyes were fixed intensely on my hand, waiting for the ink to strike the paper. I let the plastic pen slip from my fingers, allowing it to clatter loudly against the granite counter. I let out a frustrated, heavy sigh and rubbed my knuckles. I told her my arthritis was flaring up terribly, and the thin plastic barrel of the pen was simply too painful for my stiff joints to grip properly. Her jaw tightened for a microscopic fraction of a second, a brief flash of pure lethal annoyance breaking through her sweet facade. But before she could offer to guide my hand or force the issue, I reached into the breast pocket of my wool cardigan. I told her I preferred to use my own drafting pen because the heavy metal barrel was much easier for my aching hands to control. I pulled out the sleek silver architect pen that Jonathan Pierce had given me during our emergency legal consultation in the city. Vanessa immediately relaxed her smile, returning as she nodded enthusiastically. She did not care what instrument I used as long as my legal name appeared on that final binding line. She did not know that the pen I was holding was a highly specialized tool used strictly in advanced architectural drafting and secure document transport. The heavy silver barrel did not contain standard permanent ink. It was loaded with a highly volatile synthetic chemical compound developed specifically for drafting temporary blueprints. When the liquid first touched the paper, it appeared as a stark, dark blue ink, indistinguishable from any standard high-grade fountain pen. But the chemical bonds of the compound were incredibly unstable. The moment the liquid was exposed to standard atmospheric oxygen and room temperature heat, the molecular structure began to aggressively break down. Within 24 hours, the chemical compound would completely vaporize into the surrounding air. It would leave the paper absolutely blank without a single microscopic trace of pigment or residue. I uncapped the heavy silver pen and positioned the metallic nib over the dotted legal line. I did not hesitate. I pressed down and wrote my full legal name, Richard Caldwell, with slow, deliberate strokes. The dark blue ink flowed beautifully across the crisp white paper, sinking deeply into the fibers. The signature was absolutely perfect. It was authentic, undeniable, and completely temporary. Vanessa let out a sharp, breathless laugh of pure triumph. She snatched the document from the granite counter the exact second I lifted the pen. She did not even bother to review the signature closely. She simply blew gently across the wet ink to accelerate the drying process, entirely unaware that the warm air buffoon from her own lungs was actually accelerating the chemical vaporization of her victory. She folded the thick document carefully and slipped it securely into a heavy manila folder. She told me she would take care of mailing it first thing in the morning. I capped my silver pen and slipped it quietly back into my pocket. I watched her practically dance back to the stove, her entire body buzzing with the electric thrill of a successful heist. She believed she held the ultimate key to my destruction safely inside that folder. She believed she had outsmarted a foolish old man and a gullible pilot husband. She believed that by tomorrow afternoon she would be a multimillionaire living a life of absolute untouchable luxury. She was holding a blank piece of paper. The final fail-safe required by her international bankers was already quietly destroying itself inside her bag. When the European underwriters opened that folder tomorrow to verify my consent, they would find nothing but an empty signature line. The loan verification would instantly freeze, triggering a massive internal fraud alert. But the wire transfer process we had secretly armed with the Federal Bureau would already be in motion. The silent deception was completely finalized. I had literally signed her federal arrest warrant using the very document she provided to destroy me. I picked up my mug of chamomile tea and took a slow, warm sip. I looked at her back as she stirred the simmering dinner, and I felt a profound cold peace settle entirely over my mind. The trap was locked. The escape routes were completely severed. Now we only had to wait for Daniel to walk through the front door and let the final act of this tragedy unfold. The heavy hum of a vehicle engine echoed through the front window, breaking the quiet atmosphere of the living room. Headlights swept across the dark walls and illuminated the dust particles dancing in the air. My son had returned from the airport. I stood up from my leather armchair and walked slowly toward the foyer, leaning heavily on my cane to maintain my frail disguise. The front door opened, and Daniel stepped inside the house. He dropped his heavy black flight bag onto the hardwood floor with a dull, hollow thud. He looked absolutely terrible. His commercial airline uniform was perfectly pressed, but the man wearing it looked as though he had aged a decade in a single day. Dark circles bruised the pale skin beneath his eyes, and his jaw was locked in a tight, rigid line of suppressed agony. He saw me standing in the shadows of the hallway. He stepped close to me before Vanessa could hear him over the sound of the loud kitchen ventilation fan. He leaned in and spoke in a voice so incredibly quiet, it was barely a breath. He told me that during the long flight home he had stared out at the dark ocean and realized the true, calculated depth of what she had done to him. He whispered that over the past 3 years, Vanessa had systematically isolated him from every single friend he had ever known. She had constantly complained about his college roommates until he simply stopped inviting them over to keep the peace. She had manufactured petty arguments with his fellow pilots, ensuring he never attended their weekend social gatherings. She had slowly and deliberately severed every external bond in his life, convincing him that he only needed her and the brilliant financial guidance of Colin Stanford. He looked at me with hollow, shattered eyes and said he felt completely suffocated because she had made herself his entire world just so she could burn it down without anyone noticing. I placed my hand firmly on his shoulder, gripping the dark fabric of his uniform jacket. I told him he was not alone, and that true character is built in the absolute darkest moments of our lives. I reminded him that we were going to end this tonight, and that he needed to gather every ounce of his professional discipline to survive the next few hours. The sound of the kitchen fan suddenly switched off. The sharp clicking of Vanessa's heels echoed on the ceramic tile floor as she walked rapidly into the hallway. Daniel instantly dropped his chin, took a deep, stabilizing breath, and forced his facial muscles to completely relax. When Vanessa turned the corner, my son looked up and delivered the most difficult performance of his entire life. Vanessa let out a high, joyful squeal and threw her arms around his neck, pressing her body tightly against his chest. She welcomed him home and told him how terribly much she had missed him while he was flying his routes. Daniel did not pull away. He wrapped his arms around the woman who had just crossed an ocean to bankrupt him. He held her close and kissed the top of her head. He smiled a warm, exhausted smile and told her it was wonderful to be back in his own house. I watched the exchange from the shadows, feeling a surge of profound, deep respect for my son. He was enduring the physical touch of a venomous snake without flinching. His emotional restraint was absolute perfection. Vanessa stepped back, completely fooled by his calm, loving demeanor. She took his hand and led him toward the dining room, promising him a wonderful evening and a delicious home-cooked meal. The dining room table was set with our finest crystal glasses and the expensive silver flatware my late wife had purchased decades ago. Vanessa was bustling around the large room, pouring expensive red wine into the tall glasses and adjusting the folded linen napkins. Daniel sat at the head of the table, quietly sipping his ice water, playing the role of the tired pilot, winding down after a grueling international rotation. I sat to his right, maintaining my hunched posture and my blank, docile expression. Vanessa stopped at the end of the table and clapped her hands together lightly to get our attention. She announced that she had a wonderful surprise for us tonight. She looked directly at Daniel and said that since he had finished his flight schedule early and since their investment portfolios were performing so incredibly well, she thought it was the perfect time to celebrate their future. She explained with a bright, innocent smile that she had taken the liberty of calling Colin Stanford, their private wealth manager, to invite him over for a celebratory dinner. The sheer blinding arrogance of her statement hung in the air like thick, toxic smoke. She had invited her accomplice, her lover, the very man who had helped her forge my signature and steal my property, to sit at my dining table and eat my food. She wanted to revel in her hidden victory right in front of our faces. She wanted the ultimate psychological thrill of drinking wine with the two men she believed she had completely conquered and destroyed. Before Daniel could even formulate a verbal response, the front doorbell rang with a sharp, piercing chime. Vanessa smiled brightly and walked swiftly to the foyer to greet our special guest. Daniel looked across the wide table at me. His hands were gripping the edges of the heavy wooden table so hard his knuckles were completely white. I gave him a single, slow nod, urging him to maintain his composure for just a little while longer. Vanessa returned to the dining room, leading Colin Stanford by the arm. Colin looked immaculate in a tailored navy blue suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, projecting the ultimate confident image of corporate success. He walked directly over to Daniel and extended his right hand, offering a warm, highly professional smile. He congratulated Daniel on his hard work and praised the rapid, massive growth of their financial assets over the past few days. Daniel stood up slowly and shook the hand of the man who was actively trying to destroy him. He thanked Colin for his diligent service and invited him to take a comfortable seat at the table. Colin sat down directly opposite me and raised his crystal wine glass in a polite toast to the health and prosperity of our family. They were completely voluntarily walking directly into the guillotine. They thought they were untouchable, sitting in the beautiful castle they had just stolen. They had absolutely no idea that the federal tripwire had already been crossed in Europe, and their entire world was about to violently collapse around them. The clinking of crystal glasses echoed through the dining room as Colin Stanford lowered his wine. He took a slow, appreciative sip and praised Vanessa for her exquisite taste in vintage reds. The dinner commenced with an air of suffocating civility. Vanessa moved gracefully around the large oak table, serving generous portions of roasted lamb and seasoned vegetables. The fragrant aroma of the heavy meal completely masked the absolute rot sitting at the center of our family. I watched Colin carefully from beneath my lowered brow. He was a man entirely consumed by his own perceived brilliance. He cut his meat with precise, confident strokes, acting less like a guest and more like the newly crowned master of the estate. The conversation flowed with a terrifying ease. Colin leaned back in his heavy wooden chair and began discussing the current state of the global financial markets. He spoke directly to Daniel, using complex economic terms to establish his intellectual dominance. He mentioned that he had just returned from a highly successful business trip to Europe early that morning. He said the overseas markets were ripe for aggressive expansion and that he was actively moving his top-tier clients into more liquid international positions. Vanessa sat beside my son, nodding enthusiastically. She chimed in, adding that she felt incredibly secure, knowing their future was being managed by someone with such aggressive international vision. The double meanings layered within their casual dialogue were absolutely sickening. They were openly discussing the theft of the $8 million right in front of the man they had just robbed. Daniel chewed his food slowly. His facial expression remained one of polite, sincere interest. He swallowed and looked directly at the wealth manager who had destroyed his life. Daniel told Colin that he was exhausted from flying commercial routes and that he was deeply relieved to have someone he could trust completely handling the heavy burden of their financial security. Colin smiled a wide, perfectly practiced corporate smile. He looked my son right in the eye and promised that Daniel would never have to worry about money ever again. He stated that by tomorrow morning, their entire financial landscape would be permanently transformed. The sheer suffocating irony of his promise hung in the warm air of the dining room. Colin believed he was predicting their absolute wealth, but he was actually predicting his own devastating federal indictment. Beneath the polished surface of the heavy oak table, the physical deception was even more brazen. I dropped my linen napkin intentionally, letting it fall onto the hardwood floor. I bent down slowly, gripping the edge of the table with trembling hands to retrieve it. In the brief moment my head was below the table, I saw exactly what I expected to see. Colin had extended his long leg completely across the open space. His polished leather shoe was resting intimately against the bare ankle of my daughter-in-law. They were casually touching each other, brushing their legs together in the dark, while my son sat calmly just inches away. I pulled myself back up into my chair and let out a soft, pathetic cough. Vanessa immediately shot me a look of profound irritation before quickly masking it with a false smile. She asked if the lamb was too tough for my teeth. I shook my head and thanked her profusely for the wonderful meal, keeping my voice weak and submissive. My brief interruption only fueled their massive egos. They looked at me and saw nothing but a dying obstacle that had already been legally removed. As the main course concluded, Vanessa stood up from the table. Her eyes were shining with a dark, intoxicating thrill. She announced that such a highly profitable week deserved a proper conclusion. She walked over to the antique mahogany sideboard and retrieved a bottle of incredibly expensive champagne she had undoubtedly purchased with my son's stolen retirement funds. She placed 3 crystal flutes on the table explicitly, leaving me out of the final celebration. The stage was perfectly set. The predators were completely relaxed, their bellies full of rich food, and their minds clouded by absolute arrogance. They had voluntarily walked into the center of the execution chamber, and now it was finally time to pull the lever. The pale golden liquid bubbled in the tall crystal flutes, casting small, fractured reflections of light across the dark, polished surface of the dining room table. Vanessa picked up her glass, holding it delicately by the long, elegant stem. She looked across the table at Colin Stanford, her eyes shining with an unmistakable toxic triumph. She turned to Daniel and offered him a blinding, flawless smile that did not reach the cold depths of her eyes. She raised her glass high into the warm air, demanding the absolute attention of the room. She proposed a toast to new beginnings, to unlimited expanding horizons, and to a beautiful future completely free of dead weight and old burdens. She looked directly at me when she delivered that last line. It was a thinly veiled declaration of my impending eviction and imprisonment. Colin raised his glass in perfect synchronization, his pristine corporate smile stretched wide across his face. He echoed her sentiment, drinking to the massive, sudden success of their aggressive new portfolio. They tilted their heads back and let the expensive champagne slide down their throats, entirely consumed by the intoxicating delusion of their own brilliance. Daniel sat completely still, his untouched glass resting on the table before him. He was staring at his wife with a look of absolute chilling detachment. I placed my linen napkin carefully beside my plate. I placed both of my hands flat against the thick oak table and pushed myself up. I did not lean heavily on my cane. I did not let my knees tremble or my shoulders sag. I stood completely upright, pulling my spine into perfect, rigid alignment. The sudden, abrupt shift in my physical presence immediately altered the atmospheric pressure of the dining room. The hunched, dying old man they had been mocking all evening vanished entirely, replaced by the cold, calculating structural engineer who had just dismantled the foundation of their entire lives. Vanessa slowly lowered her glass, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows pulling together in a sharp, deep frown of confusion. She asked me what I was doing, her voice carrying a sharp edge of sudden irritation. She told me to sit back down before I lost my balance and hurt myself. She reached out a hand as if to guide me back into my chair, treating me like an unruly toddler who had interrupted an important adult dinner party. I did not sit down. I reached into the deep pocket of my wool cardigan and pulled out my digital tablet. I placed it flat on the center of the dining table, directly between the crystal wine glasses and the remnants of the roasted lamb. The screen was completely black. I looked directly into Vanessa's eyes, holding her gaze with absolute, unwavering authority. I told her that before we celebrated the future, I wanted to take a brief moment to review the remarkable events of the past 24 hours. I reached out and tapped the center of the dark glass screen. The tablet immediately illuminated, casting a stark, harsh blue light against their faces. A high-definition video began to play. The footage was crystal clear, captured by the hidden security camera I had installed in the living room bookshelf months ago. The video showed me sitting on the sofa, handing a piece of paper to a woman who looked exactly like the woman currently sitting at the table. The audio recorded perfectly. My voice echoed through the dining room, playing the pathetic, foolish elder. Then the voice of Melanie, her identical twin sister, filled the room. The audio captured Melanie accepting the $10,000 check, her voice vibrating with desperate, overwhelming greed. The video clearly showed Melanie slipping the money into her pocket and promising to keep my secret trip to the bank entirely safe from her sister. The silence that followed the end of the video was absolute and entirely deafening. The color drained completely from Vanessa's face, leaving her skin the pale, sickly color of dirty chalk. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. She stared at the frozen digital image of her twin sister on the screen, her perfectly constructed reality suddenly fracturing into a million jagged pieces. She realized in a single terrifying heartbeat that her flawless physical alibi had been completely compromised and bought for a mere fraction of what they were trying to steal. Colin Stanford reacted with the rapid, panicked instinct of a cornered animal. He placed his champagne flute down so hard, the delicate crystal stem completely snapped, slicing directly into his thumb. He ignored the dark blood pooling on the pristine white linen tablecloth. He stammered that this was an absurd invasion of privacy and attempted to push his heavy wooden chair back from the table to escape the room. I did not let him move. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out a thick stack of printed papers. I dropped them heavily onto the oak table right beside the illuminated tablet. I told Colin he did not need to worry about domestic privacy because his recent travel itinerary was now a matter of public federal record. I spread the papers across the wood. The first document was the official airline flight manifest, clearly highlighting both of their names on the nonstop route to Charles de Gaulle Airport. The next items were high-resolution photographs my son had taken in the hallway of the Parisian hotel, clearly showing Colin and Vanessa entering Suite 412 together. The final document I placed face up on the table was a printed copy of the massive $8 million offshore loan agreement, complete with my perfectly forged signature resting on the bottom line. Vanessa began to physically shake. Her hands trembled so violently she had to grip the edge of the heavy wooden table simply to keep herself upright. She looked frantically at Daniel, expecting to see the usual confusion or blind, trusting anger she had manipulated for years. Instead, she met the cold, dead eyes of a man who already knew every single agonizing detail of her treason. She realized Daniel was not the clueless victim returning from a long flight. He was the silent executioner, sitting quietly at the head of the table. She tried to speak. She tried to formulate a desperate lie, attempting to claim the documents were fabricated and the video was a terrible misunderstanding. Her voice cracked, breaking into a pathetic, wet whisper. I cut her off completely. I leaned forward, resting my knuckles on the table, and delivered the final absolute truth. I told them I knew about the drained retirement accounts. I knew about the forged revocation of my life estate clause. I knew about their elaborate plan to declare me legally incompetent and lock me permanently inside a psychiatric facility. Colin Stanford's polished corporate arrogance completely evaporated. He looked at the forged loan agreement, and the breath left his lungs in a sharp wheeze. His chest began heaving under his expensive tailored suit. He was a financial expert. He understood the absolute legal weight of the documents resting on the table better than anyone in the room. He knew that physical evidence of a forged signature crossing international borders to secure funds was an inescapable crime. The psychological collapse of the antagonists was absolutely total. They were no longer the smug, untouchable masters of the estate. They were trapped predators staring blindly into the blinding light of their own complete and utter annihilation. The heavy oak chair scraped violently against the polished hardwood floor as Colin Stanford shoved himself away from the dining table. The sheer panic in his eyes completely erased the smooth corporate professional he had been projecting all evening. He clutched his bleeding right hand against his expensive suit jacket, staining the navy blue fabric with dark red streaks. He did not look at Vanessa. He did not look at Daniel. He stared frantically at the archway leading to the front door. His mind was rapidly calculating his only remaining option. He needed to escape the house immediately, get to his vehicle, and destroy his encrypted laptop before the authorities could trace the digital footprint of the offshore accounts. He muttered a frantic, breathless excuse about a severe misunderstanding and needing to contact his legal counsel immediately. He took 2 rapid steps toward the hallway, but he never made it to the foyer. The sound of the heavy front door opening echoed through the quiet house. Heavy, synchronized footsteps moved purposefully across the ceramic tile of the entryway. Colin froze completely, his polished leather shoes rooted to the dining room rug. Jonathan Pierce walked through the archway and stepped fully into the warm light of the dining room. My lawyer did not look like a man arriving for a late dinner. He looked like an apex predator stepping onto a fresh hunting ground. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his tailored charcoal suit hung flawlessly on his sharp frame. He carried a thick leather briefcase in his left hand. Flanking him on either side were 2 tall, broad-shouldered men wearing dark, unassuming windbreakers. They moved with the quiet, undeniable authority of federal agents. The air in the dining room instantly grew incredibly cold and dense. "Going somewhere so soon?" Colin Jonathan asked, his voice remarkably smooth and laced with a lethal, polite charm. "I strongly advise you to sit back down. Leaving an active crime scene is generally frowned upon by the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Colin swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He tried to summon his arrogant corporate persona, attempting to bluff his way out of the closing trap. He puffed out his chest and demanded to know the meaning of this intrusion. He stated that he was a licensed wealth manager and threatened to sue Jonathan for harassment and trespassing. Jonathan did not even blink. He walked slowly to the end of the long dining table directly opposite Vanessa. He placed his heavy leather briefcase flat on the polished wood and snapped the brass locks open. The sharp metallic clicks sounded like a judge bringing down a gavel. Jonathan extracted a single piece of crisp white paper bearing the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. He looked directly at Colin and began to recite the cold, hard facts. Jonathan stated that at exactly 9:15 this morning, Paris time, an international wire transfer in the amount of $8 million was authorized from the primary equity line of this exact estate. He read the specific authorization codes, noting that the transfer was executed using the professional banking credentials of one Colin Stanford and supported by a legally notarized document bearing the signature of Richard Caldwell. Vanessa let out a sudden, sharp gasp of desperate hope. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table, her eyes wide and manic. She heard the words wire transfer and authorized. In her deeply twisted mind, she believed this meant the transaction was already complete. She looked at Colin and then sneered directly at me. She proudly declared that we were too late. She stated that the money was already gone, safely resting in their offshore accounts, where no domestic court could ever touch it. She told Jonathan he could waive all the papers he wanted, but they had won. Jonathan offered her a slow, chilling smile. It was a smile completely devoid of any warmth or mercy. "The funds were indeed authorized, Vanessa." Jonathan replied, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. "And they were successfully transmitted across international borders. However, the receiving routing numbers you established in the Cayman Islands were legally intercepted early yesterday afternoon. A federal shadow hold was placed directly on the clearinghouse network." Jonathan paused, letting the absolute gravity of his words hang in the air for a long, agonizing second. "The $8 million never reached your hidden shell companies," Jonathan continued, turning his gaze back to Colin. "The moment you pressed confirm on that transaction, the funds were seamlessly diverted into a frozen escrow account controlled entirely by the federal government. You did not rob my client today, Colin. You simply provided the Federal Bureau with an irrefutable digital confession of international money laundering and wire fraud. The physical reaction was instantaneous and entirely satisfying to witness. Colin Stanford's knees completely buckled. He collapsed backward into his heavy oak chair, his mouth falling open in silent, absolute shock. The pristine, arrogant wealth manager was instantly reduced to a hollow, terrified shell. He realized the trap had not just caught him, it had completely swallowed him whole. He had personally authorized the massive fraudulent transfer using his own corporate clearance, effectively sealing his own lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary. Vanessa let out a piercing, guttural scream. It was not a scream of fear, but a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. The illusion of their romantic partnership shattered completely. She turned violently toward Colin, slamming her fists against the table. She demanded to know how he could let this happen. She accused him of being an idiot, an incompetent fool who had promised her perfect safety and absolute wealth. She shrieked that he had ruined her life completely, ignoring the fact that she was the primary architect of the entire betrayal. The two federal agents stepped forward, moving with swift, clinical precision. One agent approached Colin, while the other walked directly toward Vanessa. They did not yell. They did not draw their weapons. They simply stated the federal charges in clear, flat voices. Conspiracy to commit bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, international wire fraud. Vanessa suddenly stopped screaming. She looked at the federal agent standing beside her chair, and then turned her frantic, pleading eyes toward my son. She begged Daniel to stop them. She started crying, forcing heavy fake tears down her cheeks. She claimed Colin had manipulated her. She swore she was scared and confused and that she never truly wanted to hurt anyone. She reached her hand out across the table, begging her husband to save her. Daniel looked at her outstretched hand and slowly shook his head. He did not raise his voice. He simply told her that he had spent years trying to give her the world, and she had repaid him by trying to destroy his father. He told her she was completely on her own. I remained standing at the head of the table, watching the clinical, satisfying justice unfold. I did not scream at her. I did not hurl insults or demand apologies. I simply delivered the final cold truth. I looked at Vanessa and told her that her twin sister Melanie was already in federal custody. I explained that Melanie had attempted to cash the traceable $10,000 check I gave her, tying her directly to the conspiracy. I told Vanessa that her entire family, her entire plan, and her entire future were completely dismantled. The federal agents instructed them to stand up and place their hands behind their backs. The heavy metallic clicks of the steel handcuffs locking around their wrists echoed loudly in the dining room. It was the sound of absolute finality. The threat was neutralized. The massive structure of lies they had built had completely collapsed, and they were buried completely beneath the rubble. The moment the heavy steel handcuffs clicked around Colin Stanford's wrists, his pristine corporate loyalty completely vanished. He did not hesitate for a single second. He immediately turned his head toward the senior federal agent and began speaking in a rapid, desperate whisper. He offered to testify against Vanessa in exchange for absolute federal immunity. He claimed she was the sole mastermind behind the entire operation. He swore she had seduced him, manipulated his professional judgment, and personally executed the forged signatures. Vanessa heard every single word of his pathetic confession. The man she had planned to travel the world with the man she had trusted to secure her stolen millions was actively trading her freedom for his own survival. She spat a vicious curse at him, struggling violently against the tight metal restraints biting into her wrists. The two federal agents ignored her completely. They simply pulled her forcefully away from the heavy oak dining table and turned her toward the front door. As the agents began to march her out of the room, Daniel slowly stood up from his chair. He walked around the edge of the table and stood directly in her path. Vanessa stopped struggling and looked up at him. Her eyes wide and pleading silently, begging for a final ounce of mercy. Daniel did not say a single word. He reached down and slid the heavy gold wedding band off his left ring finger. He held it suspended in the air for a brief moment, looking at the woman he had once promised to love forever. Then he dropped it directly into the empty crystal champagne flute she had used to toast my destruction. The heavy gold ring struck the bottom of the fragile glass with a sharp ringing sound. It was the absolute end of their marriage echoing through the silent room. At that exact same moment, less than 2 miles down the road, a completely different arrest was taking place. Melanie had not gone back to her rundown apartment. Fueled by the desperate, intoxicating thrill of holding a $10,000 check, she had driven straight to a local bank branch, attempting to secure the cash before the evening deposit window closed. She was standing at the teller counter, smiling brightly, when 2 unmarked federal vehicles surrounded her silver sedan in the parking lot. The bank teller had already been notified by the bureau to silently flag the transaction. The moment Melanie handed the check across the counter, 3 federal agents stepped through the glass doors of the bank and placed her under immediate arrest for receiving stolen funds and acting as an accomplice to federal fraud. The entire criminal network Vanessa had spent a year meticulously building was completely dismantled in less than 10 minutes. The heavy front door of my home closed behind the federal agents, taking the architect of our pain away forever. The house was finally quiet again, completely purged of the toxic elements that had threatened to destroy our family. The sun rose over the quiet suburban street, casting long, warm shadows across the wooden planks of our back patio. The chaotic, suffocating energy that had infected my home for the past 12 months was completely gone. I sat in my wrought iron chair, holding a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, letting the gentle morning breeze wash over my face. The house behind me was entirely silent. There were no fake smiles, no hidden agendas, and absolutely no parasites feeding on our unconditional love. It felt as though a massive, suffocating weight had been lifted from the very foundation of the building. The sliding glass door opened with a soft, familiar rumble. Daniel stepped out onto the patio holding his own mug of hot coffee. He had taken off his crisp airline uniform and was wearing an old, faded college sweater. He looked profoundly exhausted, but the deep, dark tension that had locked his jaw for years had finally vanished. He sat down in the heavy chair beside me, staring out at the green, manicured lawn. We did not speak for a long time. The quiet space between us was not tense or uncomfortable. It was the deep, healing silence of 2 men who had just survived a catastrophic storm together. He took a slow, deep sip of his coffee and looked over at me. His eyes were finally clear. He thanked me for not letting him kick that hotel door down in Paris. He told me I had completely saved his life and his future. I reached out and rested my hand firmly on his arm. I told him that a father never stops protecting his son no matter how many years pass. People in this modern world often make a terrible, foolish mistake when they look at the elderly. They see gray hair, stiff joints, and slower steps, and they automatically assume they are looking at weakness. They confuse a quiet, patient demeanor with a fading, incompetent mind. But age is absolutely not a vulnerability. Age is a massive archive of survival. It is a lifetime spent enduring incredible pressure, calculating dangerous risks, and understanding the deep, dark flaws of human nature. Vanessa thought my silence meant I was broken, but she simply did not understand the truth. A structural engineer never screams when he spots a fatal flaw in a building. He just quietly redesigns the load-bearing walls to crush the defect entirely. Daniel nodded slowly, a genuine small smile, finally breaking through the heavy remnants of his grief. We sat together in the warm morning light, ready to rebuild our lives from the ground up. I learned a profound, lasting lesson from this terrible nightmare. True family is never defined by a legal marriage certificate or a shared address. True family is built entirely on absolute respect, unwavering loyalty, and the mutual desire to see each other thrive. The predators were permanently gone, and my son and I were finally completely free. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that unconditional love should never mean unconditional surrender. We often confuse endurance with strength, believing that if we just suffer quietly enough, the people we love will eventually realize our value. But true respect is never born from submission. When you allow someone to treat you as an expiring resource, you give them the blueprint to destroy you. Age does not diminish your intellect, your worth, or your right to demand basic human dignity. You must be the ultimate architect of your own boundaries, because the moment you stop defending your foundation, someone else will gladly tear it down to build their own castle. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences with setting boundaries in the comments below.